I asked my cheating wife's driver to give her the divorce letter while I took her to her lover. She didn't know that I knew. She didn't know that I had found out everything. The hidden messages on her cell phone, the unlikely times, and that perfume that wasn't mine. For weeks, everything had been meticulously planned, every detail recorded in silence, every piece of evidence accumulated without her noticing. There would be no hasty confrontations, tears in the heat of the moment, or fights that would lead nowhere. No. I wanted something much more devastating. I wanted her to look in the mirror and see exactly the person she had become. That day, while she smiled on the phone, thinking she was circumventing the world, I made the final adjustments to my plan. A plan that didn't involve physical revenge, but something much deeper. Something that would mark her soul in the same way she had marked mine with her betrayal. "Are you really going out with your friends tonight?" I asked casually, as she finished getting ready in front of the mirror. The tight dress, the red lipstick, and the sparkle in her eyes gave away something she thought she was hiding. "Yes, darling. Don't wait up for me, it might take a while." The lie came out with the ease of someone who had told it many times before. I just nodded, without giving any indication that I knew the truth. The driver was standing by, as always. She trusted him. After all, he was one of the few who knew how to keep a low profile. But that night he had different instructions. Somewhere along the way, she would open an envelope that would make her realize that she was not in control. That everything she thought she was hiding so well had been revealed. As she left, I sat in the empty room, the silence filled only by the echo of my thoughts. It was still hard to believe. Years of marriage, years of trust, years of building a life together, reduced to text messages, muffled laughter on the phone, and a name I should never have heard. Him. The man she chose to share something that should have been ours. In the car, she chatted animatedly with the driver, apparently not noticing the small envelope on the seat next to her. When she saw it, her expression changed. She picked it up hesitantly, as if something inside her already knew that nothing good would come of it. She opened it with trembling hands, and her eyes quickly ran over the words I had chosen so carefully. Divorce. The word printed at the top of the document was a sentence as cold as the betrayal she had committed. "Stop the car." I heard the driver tell me afterwards, reproducing the tone of despair in her voice. She wanted to go back, she wanted to face me, she wanted explanations that even she didn't have. But, following my orders, he kept going. The meeting with her lover was set, and she would have to deal with the shame of getting to him knowing that I now knew everything. In my mind, I went over every detail of those last few weeks. The sleepless nights, trying to understand where I had failed. What I had done to make her look to another man for what I thought I had given her all these years. And then, finally, I realized, it wasn't about me. It was about her. About the emptiness she tried to fill with fake smiles and forbidden touches. An emptiness that wasn't about our marriage, but about who she had become. I thought about how she would react when she walked into the restaurant and saw her lover, to whom she would now have to confess her new reality. Would he support her? Or would he run away too, realizing that the game was up? It was a risk she chose to take when she crossed the line. And I, alone in that room, felt a mixture of sadness and bitter satisfaction. Sadness at what we had lost, satisfaction at knowing that she would finally have to face the consequences of her choices. But what really consumed me was the question that wouldn't leave me alone: how far would her truth go? After all, I knew that her lover had secrets. Secrets that she, so confident, never imagined were also being used against her. But that would soon be revealed. And she had no idea. Welcome to our channel. Here, we don't support any kind of betrayal. All the stories you'll hear are fictional, created to show how betrayal destroys lives, relationships, and families. Get ready, because now you're about to embark on a story full of twists and turns, intense emotions, and an ending that will surprise you. Enjoy and prepare your heart, this is going to be a shocking experience. The house was a reflection of what Richard and Elena had built over almost 2 decades of marriage. With large windows that let in the morning sun, a living room decorated with elegant furniture and personal touches scattered in picture frames and works of art, the home was welcoming. The walls held the laughter of birthdays, late-night conversations and silences that spoke more than words. Everything there seemed solid, as if nothing could shake what they had built together. Richard was methodical and determined, qualities that led him to become a respected lawyer. The time he spent at the office was heavy, but he believed that every hour invested was for Elena and the life they wanted to have. He loved the routine of returning home, where her presence awaited him like a relief. He was a practical man, but with a romantic side that manifested itself in small gestures, flowers left on the coffee table, notes hidden between the pages of books and spontaneous compliments that left Elena smiling. Elena, for her part, was passionate about art and the freedom it provided. A painter by vocation, her studio at the bottom of the garden was a space where creativity flowed without barriers. She was delicate, but firm in her convictions. Her vision of the world was intense, and this made her see beauty in details that Richard sometimes missed. She was grateful for him, for the constant support she received to follow her passion, even if it meant long hours apart while he dealt with the demands of his career. The couple had a daughter, Sophie, 14, who was beginning to explore her own identity. She was a fascinating mix of both. She had her father's determination and her mother's artistic sensibility. Sophie was the link between Richard and Elena, something that reminded them daily of the love that had united them so many years before. In recent months, however, a subtle distance had begun to creep in. It wasn't obvious, but small gestures became less frequent. The late-night conversations dwindled, replaced by comfortable but also somewhat cold silences. Richard, involved in a complex case at work, felt more absent than he would have liked. Elena, on the other hand, found solace in her studio, losing herself in canvases and brushes, as if searching for something she couldn't even name. The mornings followed the same rhythm as always. Richard left early, leaving the smell of freshly brewed coffee in the kitchen. Elena stayed at home, taking advantage of the calm to paint before Sophie returned from school. Routine was an ally, but also a reminder of what wasn't said. At times, Richard watched her in silence as she straightened her hair, noticing an expression he couldn't decipher. He wondered if it was tiredness, boredom or something deeper. That particular evening, there was something in the air that Richard couldn't explain. He had come home early from work, hoping to surprise Elena. But when he entered the room, he found it empty. He called her name, but only the distant sound of the wind answered. He climbed the stairs, imagining that perhaps she was in her room, but she wasn't. Finally, looking out of the window, he saw the lights of the studio at the bottom of the garden on. Elena was sitting, brush in hand, concentrating on a canvas that seemed to absorb all her energy. Richard stood there for a moment, just watching her. He felt a mixture of pride and sadness. He knew how much painting meant to her, but he also noticed how it seemed to be more than just a passion. It was as if she was trying to find something within herself, something that he couldn't offer. Elena, on the other hand, also felt the weight of the distance between them. There were nights when she would look at Richard while he slept and wonder if they were losing the connection that had once defined them. She didn't doubt his love, but she couldn't help feeling that something was incomplete. Sometimes she felt guilty for thinking this, as if she was being ungrateful for the life they had. At other times, she thought it was just a phase and that everything would return to normal. At dinner that night, the conversation was light but superficial. Sophie was talking animatedly about a school project, and they both listened attentively, laughing at her jokes and encouraging her ideas. When Sophie went up to her room, Richard and Elena were alone at the table, silence settling between them. "Are you all right?" he asked, breaking the tension. "Yes, just a bit tired." "I've been painting all day," she replied, avoiding meeting his eyes. He nodded, but sensed that there was more there than she was willing to admit. He wanted to insist, but something inside him told him not to. Instead, he got up, kissed her forehead and went into the living room, where he lost himself in thought while reading a book he hadn't even registered. Later, when Elena entered the room, Richard was already in bed. She lay down next to him, but the physical distance seemed to reflect the emotional distance that was growing between them. They each turned to one side, and the room fell silent. The next morning, the routine began again. But as he left for work, Richard looked back for a moment, watching Elena at the window. She waved, but her smile seemed distant, almost mechanical. He drove to the office with an uncomfortable feeling, something he couldn't name. Elena stayed at the window for a few more seconds after he left. She sighed and returned to the studio, where her canvases and paints were waiting for her, as always. But that day, even art couldn't distract her from the restlessness she felt. When Sophie got home from school, she noticed that her mother's mood had changed. She tried to cheer her up, but Elena disguised it as tiredness. The little girl left for her room, but not without giving her a worried look. The day ended like so many others. But in Richard and Elena's hearts, something was beginning to change, something that even they didn't fully understand. As they each searched for answers, the space between them seemed to grow, becoming a silent abyss. The days went by with the same predictable cadence, but the silence that had once seemed comfortable now became suffocating for Richard. He felt that something was out of place. Elena was there, present, but at the same time she seemed distant. She laughed at Sophie's stories, asked questions, but her eyes seemed to be elsewhere. Richard tried not to pay too much attention to this feeling, rationalizing that it could be stress, perhaps an important project that she hadn't mentioned. That weekend, he decided to propose something different. A quick trip to a nearby town, a time to disconnect and perhaps rekindle the flame that seemed to have gone out. It would be nice to go out for a while, just the two of us, he said, watching Elena's reaction. She hesitated for a moment, a brief pause, but enough for Richard to notice. "I'd love to, but Sophie has that school assignment that's going to take up our whole Sunday. And I promised to help her," she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Richard nodded, but her answer planted a doubt that he couldn't shake. Determined to move on, he took advantage of Saturday to work from home, while Elena spent most of the day in the studio. Sophie, busy with the project, went back and forth between the bedroom and the living room, too distracted to notice the tension in the air. Richard convinced himself that he was imagining things, but that uncomfortable feeling wouldn't leave him. On Monday, while driving to work, he decided he needed to do something to clear up that feeling of disconnection. "Maybe I'm overreacting," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the guilt for thinking that about Elena. But over the course of the day, this idea turned into determination. He decided that he would do something he had never done before. He would ask Elena's driver to pay attention. He didn't want to keep an eye on his wife, but he needed to know whether her insecurities were well-founded or just a figment of her own mind. That afternoon, when he returned home earlier than usual, he found Elena in the studio again. He decided to go in, something he rarely did. She was painting, but the sound of the door opening made her stop moving her brush. "Hi," she said, smiling in surprise. "What's up? You're home early." Richard came in, pretending to be at ease. "I wanted to see what you've been up to. I haven't seen your paintings for a while." She hesitated before moving away from the canvas, positioning herself almost protectively, as if she didn't want him to see what she was painting. "It's not ready yet," she explained, laughing nervously. Richard shrugged, feeling that something didn't make sense. But he decided not to press. After a while, he left the studio, taking with him a growing discomfort. That night, while Elena slept beside him, Richard couldn't sleep a wink. He kept thinking about how things had changed between them, how that complicity that used to be so natural seemed to have been lost at some point. He wanted to ask, he wanted to understand, but at the same time he feared the answer. The following week, his driver reported something that made his heart stop for an instant. A simple message, but enough to confirm that something was going on. She asked to be dropped off at a different address today, and she seemed nervous, the man said hesitantly. Richard felt the weight of doubt turn into something more concrete. He thanked the driver and hung up, not knowing how to react. Over the next few days, Richard noticed subtle changes in Elena's behavior. She seemed more animated, but at the same time avoided looking him directly in the eye. He tried to remain normal, but the tension was beginning to wear him down. He decided he needed to know the truth. One afternoon, as Elena was getting ready to leave, Richard offered to drive her. "I won't need the car today, I can drop you off where you need to go," he said, smiling casually. Elena, visibly surprised, hesitated for a moment before replying. "No need, I've already called the driver. I'm meeting a friend for coffee." The justification came out quickly, but Richard noticed the haste in her gestures as she picked up her bag. He decided to follow in silence, but his determination was growing. When Elena left, he asked the driver to keep him informed. He wanted confirmation of his suspicions, even if it meant facing a painful truth. That evening, while he was waiting at home, the phone rang. The driver's voice was serious, almost hesitant. "Sir, she went to a restaurant. She was with a man. They seemed intimate." The words echoed in Richard's head. He thanked her again and hung up, feeling as if the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. He stayed in the room for hours, staring into the void, trying to process what he had just heard. He felt anger, sadness and a pain that seemed greater than he could bear. The love he felt for Elena was still there, but now mixed with something he didn't know how to deal with. The next morning, as they ate breakfast, Richard looked at Elena as if he were seeing her for the first time. She was talking about plans for the day, but he could barely hear. Her smile, which had once been one of the things he loved most, now seemed charged with something he couldn't ignore. He knew he needed to confront her, but decided to wait. He needed more time to process everything, to understand what he would do next. The betrayal was real. But there was more to the story, something he still couldn't pinpoint. Something he was about to discover. The moment that Richard had been putting off for days had finally arrived. He knew he couldn't go on living with Elena without facing the truth. Dinner that night was especially quiet. Sophie had gone off to study with friends, leaving the two of them alone. The atmosphere was dense, charged with a tension that seemed to grow by the minute. Elena seemed distracted, her eyes on her plate, avoiding eye contact. Richard studied her every move, trying to decipher what was going on in her mind. When she got up to remove the plates, he stopped her with a firm hand on her arm. "We need to talk," he said, his tone calm but unmistakably serious. Elena paused, still holding the plates, before sighing and sitting down again. "What happened?" she asked, although the look on her face suggested that she knew exactly what was coming. Richard took a deep breath, as if trying to summon up all the strength he possessed to face what was coming next. "I know about him," he said, each word carrying the weight of the pain he felt. Elena's face paled, her eyes wide as if an invisible mask had just fallen. I don't know what you're talking about," she tried, but her voice failed her, betraying the truth she was desperately trying to hide. Richard didn't look away, his countenance a mixture of disappointment and determination. "I know where you've been, I know who you were with. There's no point in pretending." The words echoed in the room, leaving a heavy silence between them. Elena lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze. "Richard, please let me explain," she began, but was interrupted. "Explain what?" "That you decided to betray the trust we've built up over all these years. That you thought I'd never find out." His voice trembled, a combination of anger and hurt that he could barely control. Elena finally looked at him, her eyes shining with tears. "I never meant to hurt you. I don't know what happened to me. It was a mistake, Richard. I know that. A mistake." He laughed, but there was no humor in his tone. "A mistake is forgetting to buy milk at the market, Elena. Not that. Not what you did." She started to cry, but he felt no compassion at that moment. "How long has it been?" he asked, his voice more controlled now, but still cutting. 3 months, she admitted, the words coming out almost as a whisper. He closed his eyes, as if the weight of the answer was physical. "Why? What did I do wrong? What haven't I been able to give you?" The vulnerability in his voice cut through the silence, leaving Elena even more devastated. "It's not you, Richard. It was something in me. I felt lost. Like something was missing, and I didn't know how to fill that void." She tried to hold his hand, but he pulled away, as if her touch was painful. "Did you choose to cheat instead of talking to me? Instead of trying to work things out? Elena, we had something real. Something that I thought was strong enough to overcome anything. But now," he stood up, pacing back and forth in the room, as if trying to find a focus amidst the maelstrom of emotions. "I know there's no excuse for what I did," she said, her voice breaking. "But, Richard, I need you to know that it was never about love. It was never about you." He stopped, looking at her with an expression that mixed incredulity and contempt. "And what was it, then? An adventure? A moment of fun to fill your time? Because, to me, it seems like you've thrown away everything we've built for nothing." Elena tried to speak again, but was interrupted by the sound of Richard's phone vibrating on the table. He looked at the screen, saw the driver's name and decided to answer. "Sir, I have something to tell you, something you might need to hear right now," the driver's voice began, hesitantly. Richard left the room, leaving Elena alone for a moment. He listened intently, every word from the man on the other end of the line hitting him like a blow. When he returned, his face was pale, but his eyes were filled with a new determination. Elena stared at him, confused. "What is it?" she asked, but he didn't answer immediately. "There's something you haven't told me, something that makes all this even worse." His voice was cold, almost emotionless. "He's not who you think he is, Elena. Not just any man." "I don't understand," she began, but Richard interrupted her. "He's been using you. Not out of love, not out of desire, but out of something more calculated." He picked up an envelope he had brought with him, containing the records of conversations, messages and other evidence he had gathered over the last few days. "All of it, Elena. He fooled you as much as you fooled me." She picked up the envelope with trembling hands, leafing through the papers quickly as her expression changed from confusion to horror. "This can't be true," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It is true," Richard confirmed. "And you put everything we built at risk for someone who was only interested in using you. How do you think that makes me feel?" Elena let the papers fall to the floor, unable to process what she had just discovered. Richard watched her for a moment, before turning and leaving the room, leaving her alone with her choices and their consequences. The betrayal was not hers alone, but she was now the victim of the same kind of disloyalty she had inflicted on the man she once loved. Elena stood motionless in the room, her hands shaking as she clutched the papers that had slid to the floor. Her mind was a whirlpool of shame, regret and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. Not only had she betrayed Richard, but now she was discovering that she had been used in a way she had never imagined. The pain was almost unbearable, but she knew she had to face him again. She couldn't let things end like this. Richard, on the other hand, was in the garden, sitting on a wooden bench he had built himself years ago, before Sophie was born. He stared into the void, trying to process what he had just revealed. Elena's betrayal was already a deep blow, but the fact that she had been manipulated by a man who clearly didn't care about her added another layer of hurt and indignation. He wasn't sure what was keeping him there. Part of him wanted to scream, to demand answers, while another wanted to simply disappear and never look back. The sound of the door opening interrupted his thoughts. Elena walked up to him, hesitant but determined. "Richard, please, we need to talk." Her voice was hoarse, and he realized that she had been crying. But he didn't answer immediately, he just tilted his head, as if waiting for her to say something that might change the situation. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what he was doing. I never imagined it could be anything other than what it was. She struggled to find the words, and each sentence seemed to come out with effort. I feel like an idiot. A complete idiot. Richard finally looked up, his eyes filled with a dangerous calm. You should, he replied, the coldness in his voice more forceful than any shout. But the question isn't just about what he did. It's about what you did. You opened the door to this, Elena. You allowed it to happen. She lowered her head, unable to hold his gaze. I know. I know I have no excuse for what I did. I just lost myself. And, at some point, I thought I might find something outside of here, something I didn't even know I was looking for. Did you find it? The question was direct, and she hesitated before answering. No, she finally said. I found nothing but more pain. And now I'm here, destroying you, our family, everything we've built. I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but please, let me try to make it right. Richard shook his head, a humorless laugh escaping his lips. Fix it? How do you fix something like that, Elena? How do you look at someone again and feel you can trust them again? Because, honestly, I don't know if I can. She knelt in front of him, holding his hands, but he didn't return the gesture. Richard, I know I made a mistake. I know I was selfish and stupid. But I love you. I always have. And I'd do anything to prove it to you. He stared at her for a long moment, before standing up abruptly, pulling his hands back. Love, Elena? Do you call it love? Because, for me, love means loyalty. It means respect. And what you've done is trample all over that. She followed him as he began to walk through the garden, desperate not to let him get any further away. I'm not trying to justify anything. I don't want this to be the end. Please, Richard, tell me what I can do. He stopped and turned around, the pain evident in his eyes. You want to know what you can do? Start by being honest. Tell me everything. Every detail. Because, if there's a chance I'll consider continuing with this, I need to know that there are no more lies between us. Elena hesitated again, but realized that he was right. If she wanted any hope of redemption, she would have to be completely honest. So she started talking, telling him about how she had met the man, how understanding and charming he had seemed at first, how she had been seduced not just by his words, but by the idea of something different, something exciting. She told him about the encounters, about how it made her feel alive, even if she knew deep down that it was wrong. Richard listened in silence, each word cutting like a knife, but he knew he needed to hear it. When she finished, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. Elena expected him to say something, anything, but he just stood there, staring at her as if trying to decide who she really was. Did you know he was married? The question came suddenly, and she shook her head quickly. No. He said he was single. I never knew until now, until you showed me those papers. Her voice was full of shame, and Richard could see that she was being honest. He's married. He has children. And he used you to escape his own reality. And now, look at us, look at what's left. He gestured towards the house, as if to emphasize the emptiness he felt. Elena swallowed, unable to find words to ease the tension. Finally, Richard sighed, wiping his hand across his face as if trying to ward off emotional exhaustion. I need time, he said, his voice lower now. I need space to think. Because right now, all I see when I look at you is betrayal. And I don't know if I can get over it. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll give you all the time and space you need. Just, please don't give up on us yet. Richard didn't reply, he just turned and started walking back to the house. Elena stood there, alone in the garden, feeling the weight of her choices fall on her like never before. She knew she had a long road ahead of her, and that nothing could guarantee that Richard would be waiting at the end of it. But, for the first time in a long time, she was determined to fight for what she had lost. Even if it meant facing the darkest parts of herself. Richard spent the next few days immersed in a mixture of conflicting thoughts. The silence between him and Elena was almost palpable. She had done what she had promised, she had given him the space and time he had asked for. However, even when she was in the same room, he felt as if a chasm separated them. He watched her attempts to keep the house running as before, her careful interactions with Sophie, and the way she avoided looking at him directly. Every gesture seemed charged with a guilt that she couldn't disguise. Sophie, on the other hand, began to notice that something was wrong. Her parents, who used to share glances and subtle laughs, now seemed more distant than ever. She tried to strike up a conversation with Richard one evening while he was reading a book in the living room. "Is everything all right, Dad? You seem different," he said, his voice full of concern. He put the book down and looked at her, trying to offer a reassuring smile, but failing miserably. "I'm fine, darling. Just a bit tired. The work has been intense." She didn't look convinced, but decided not to press. Something in her gaze, however, made Richard realize how much this situation was beginning to affect not only him, but also Sophie. Meanwhile, Elena spent long hours in the studio, trying to lose herself in her paintings, but finding little solace. Her hands held the brush, but inspiration seemed to slip away, replaced by a constant heaviness in her chest. She knew that every second that passed without a sign from Richard was a missed opportunity to win him back. But she also knew that pressing him could push him further away. One morning, while Sophie was at school, Elena found the courage to try to start a conversation. She found him in the kitchen, drinking coffee, his gaze fixed on the cup as if it held the answers to his problems. "I thought I'd write to you," he began, his voice hesitant. He looked at her, surprised. "Right?" she asked, with an arched eyebrow. "Yes," she replied. "I don't know if I can say everything I feel without getting in the way, but maybe I can put it into words, something that makes sense." Richard nodded slowly. "If that's what you feel you need to do, do it. I'll read it." There was something in his tone that made her heart squeeze. It wasn't anger, but it wasn't warmth either. It was a disconcerting neutrality, as if he were trying to remain completely oblivious to the emotions that were still bubbling under the surface. The following days were filled with careful attempts by both of them to avoid conflict, but the tension persisted. Richard began to leave the house more, telling himself that he needed time to think, but deep down he knew that he also needed to escape. He found refuge in solitary walks, long hours at the office and, occasionally, in quiet cafes where he could reflect without interruption. It was on one of these afternoons that he received an unexpected message from his driver. "Sir, I thought I should warn you. The man, he tried to contact me. He wanted information." Richard frowned, reading the message several times. Why would Elena's lover be trying to get close to him, even indirectly? It rekindled the anger he had been trying to contain. It wasn't just about Elena and the betrayal. It was about the man who had come into his life without permission, messed everything up and still dared to act as if he had some right. Without answering his driver, Richard returned home early that evening. When he arrived, he found Elena in the living room, her face illuminated by the dim light of the lamp. She looked surprised to see him there, but her expression quickly changed to concern when she noticed Richard's determined gaze. "We need to talk," he said, and she nodded, visibly apprehensive. He sat down opposite her, taking a deep breath before beginning. "I got a message today. From the driver. He told me that the man tried to contact you. He wants information, Elena. And I want to know why." She paled, her eyes wide as she processed what he had just said. I didn't know that," she said, her voice shaking. "I haven't spoken to him. After you showed me what you discovered, I cut all ties. I have no idea what he wants. Richard studied her for a long moment, trying to determine whether she was being sincere. Finally, he shook his head, letting out a heavy sigh. This has to stop, Elena. For good. I don't want any more shadows of that man in our lives. I agree, she replied quickly. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure of that. Her tone was firm, but he still felt a hesitation that he couldn't ignore. In the days that followed, Richard took steps to protect himself. He consulted lawyers, reviewed financial documents and made sure that the damage done didn't extend beyond the emotional. He knew he still had a lot to decide about his future with Elena, but he needed to feel in control of his own life again before making any decisions. Meanwhile, Elena struggled to find a balance between giving Richard space and demonstrating that she was committed to repairing what she had destroyed. She began to write the letter she had promised, but every sentence seemed insufficient, every attempt to explain her feelings sounded empty. She knew that no words would be enough to erase what she had done, but she still wrote, hoping that somehow her words would reach Richard's heart. When she finally handed him the letter, he accepted it without saying a word. He read it in silence, while she waited in another room, her nerves on edge. When he had finished, he sat for a long time, holding the paper in his hands. There was sincerity in her words, a genuine regret that he could feel. But there was also a weight that he knew he couldn't simply ignore. Richard entered the room where she was, the letter still in his hands. I've read it, he said, his voice controlled. And I believe you're being honest. But that doesn't change what happened. I know, she replied, tears starting to stream down her face. I don't expect it to. I just hope you'll see that I'm willing to fight for us. He looked at her, and for a moment there was something in his eyes that seemed like a spark of hope. But it quickly disappeared, replaced by the same serious expression he had been carrying for weeks. I need more time, Elena, he finally said. I need more time to decide what I want, to understand if I can go through with it. She nodded, knowing she couldn't ask for more than that. As he left the room, she stood there alone, feeling both relief and despair. The road ahead was still uncertain, but at least now she knew there was a chance, however small, of rebuilding what had been destroyed. And for now, that was enough. Richard decided that the only way to really find an answer to his emotional turmoil was to move away. He left the house on a cold morning, without saying much to Elena, leaving only a note for Sophie, assuring her that he was fine, but needed time. Elena watched through the window as he put a suitcase in the trunk of his car and drove off. She didn't try to stop him, she knew that insisting would be pointless. Sophie, on the other hand, was devastated. Why did he have to go? She asked her mother, tears streaming down her face. Elena tried to console her daughter, but felt powerless. How could she explain something that even she couldn't justify? Richard drove for hours until he reached a small cabin he had rented in a secluded spot. He wanted silence, he wanted space to think without being constantly reminded of what had happened. The days blended into a routine of walking, reading, and long hours staring into the void. But the silence he so desperately sought also brought questions. He wondered whether he would be able to forgive Elena, whether he wanted to rebuild the relationship or move on alone. He thought about Sophie, the life they had created, and how his absence might affect her. Meanwhile, Elena was determined to do something different. After weeks of reflection, she realized that it wasn't enough just to ask for forgiveness. It was necessary to show concrete action. She met with the lawyer to resolve financial issues, protecting the family's assets and showing Richard that she was willing to act responsibly. She also started therapy, something she had always put off. Elena knew that part of what had led her to cheat was rooted in problems she had never had the courage to face. Sophie, seeing her mother's efforts, began to develop a mixture of compassion and resentment. You're trying to make amends now, but all this wouldn't have happened if you'd thought about it before, she said one tense afternoon. Elena accepted the words, without defending herself. She knew Sophie needed to get things off her chest. Little by little, the bond between mother and daughter began to strengthen, although the scars were still visible. Elena's lover, whose interference in their lives had been the spark for all the chaos, faced his own consequences. Richard's actions in exposing the truth about his intentions reached the man's wife, who immediately began divorce proceedings. He lost not only his family, but also his respectable position at work when the details of the affair became public. It was the kind of karma that seemed inevitable, but for Richard, it brought no relief. He paid for his choices, but what about ours, he often thought. After almost 2 months away, Richard received a letter from Elena. Unlike the first, this one was brief but to the point. I'm changing, Richard. Not for you, but because I realized I needed to change. I want you to know that, whatever you decide, I will always cherish what we've built and regret what I've destroyed. Sophie misses you, and I know I will too forever, if this is the end. He read the letter several times, tucking it into his coat pocket before heading out for a walk. The cold wind cut across his face, but he was lost in his own thoughts. He knew he had a choice to make, and that whatever it was, it would change their lives forever. But, above all, he wanted to do what was right for Sophie. She deserved stability, she deserved to see her parents deal with adversity in a mature way. That night, Richard made a decision. He returned home in silence, arriving while Elena and Sophie were having dinner. The sound of the door opening made them both look up, surprise and hope on their faces. Sophie was the first to get up, running to hug him. He held her tightly, feeling the weight of the distance finally dissolve. Elena stood, hesitating. "Are you back?" she asked, her voice heavy with emotion. Richard nodded. "Yes. But that doesn't mean everything is settled." He paused, looking at her with an indecipherable expression. "I need time, but I want to be here. I want to rebuild what's possible, at least for Sophie. And maybe for us too." Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Thank you for giving us this chance." The next few months were a time of adjustment. Richard and Elena started going to couples therapy, something he never imagined he would do. The conversations were intense, sometimes painful, but gradually they began to find small sparks of the connection they had once shared. Sophie watched from afar, hopeful but cautious. She knew her parents were trying, but she also understood that the outcome was still uncertain. Meanwhile, Richard began to rediscover parts of himself that he had lost in the process. He took up hobbies that he had put aside and began to spend more time with friends, allowing himself to breathe outside the context of the marriage. Elena continued her personal journey, exploring new ways of expressing her art and facing the shadows of her choices. One day, while walking together after a therapy session, Richard stopped and looked at Elena. "I still don't know where this is going," he said, his voice calm. "But I'm willing to try. Not out of obligation, but because I think there's still something here worth saving." She smiled, and for the first time in a long time, it was a genuine smile. "I think so too," she replied, taking his hand. Their life didn't go back to the way it was before. The scars remained, but they also served as reminders of what they had overcome. Sophie, seeing her parents working together, began to believe that it might be possible to rebuild something, however imperfectly. And so, as their journey continued, it became clear that the true meaning of a satisfying ending was not to return to what was lost, but to build something new from the wreckage. And for Richard and Elena, that was enough. Now that you've made it this far, let us know what you thought of the story. Your opinion is very important. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories. And remember, this channel in no way supports any kind of betrayal. Thanks for listening.